mid-July 1944. An American armored platoon idles just below the crest of a gentle rise in the Norman countryside, immediately followed by the hollow, ringing impact of solid steel striking steel. The lead Sherman abruptly stops. The procedure required absolute nerve. The gunner would sit with his eye pressed to the optic, staring at an empty, quiet patch of grass. He could hear the heavy rumble of the steel tracks and the roar of the engine growing louder as the tank crested the hill. The massive steel hull would suddenly block the sunlight, filling the narrow slit of his scope. The gunner was trained not to fire immediately. He had to wait a fraction of a second for the thick front armor to pass, letting the thin steel flank slide directly into the crosshairs. Then he pulled the lanyard. The high-velocity armor-piercing shell traveled the short distance in less than a quarter of a second. It punched through the flat side plate with mechanical efficiency. Because the gun was buried, the Americans above heard the metallic impact before they registered the sound of the shot. Because the geometry was engineered perfectly, the crew inside the tank rarely had time to realize they had been outmaneuvered. But an American armored platoon did not travel as a single vehicle. They moved in staggered columns or line formations, bringing immense collective firepower to the front. One hidden gun might claim the lead tank, but the violent impact of the shell would immediately alert the trailing crews that they were under attack. The question was, once the trap was finally triggered, a bright jet of flame violently vents from a small hole punched cleanly through its right front glacis. How did the defenders ensure that the rest of the superior American platoon could not simply reverse course or overwhelm the isolated gun? The sudden destruction of the lead Sherman triggered an immediate, drilled response from the trailing crews. Standard American doctrine dictated that the surviving tanks should rapidly deploy into a line formation, identify the source of incoming fire, and overwhelm it with high-explosive shells. But as the drivers desperately manipulated their steering levers to fan out across the pasture, they collided with the physical reality of the bocage. The ancient earthen walls bordering the field were impassable. The tanks could not deploy. They were funneled into a natural, enclosed arena. The German defense relied on this exact restriction. A proper reverse slope ambush was never built around a single, isolated weapon. It was an interlocking system of pre-registered kill zones. Before the black smoke had even fully cleared from the first impact, a second heavy gun, buried deep in a different hedgerow on the opposite flank, fired its shot. This second gunner did not target the next tank in line. He targeted the trailing vehicle at the very rear of the column. Just as it exposed its flank coming down the slope, the high-velocity round smashed through the steel drive sprocket, instantly shattering the track. Within seconds, the hatch blows open, and thick, oily black smoke begins to billow into the grey morning sky, and severing the drivetrain. The rear tank lurched to a violent, grinding halt, effectively blocking the narrow dirt lane leading back to the safety of the crest. The trap was now fully closed. The American platoon was boxed in. The burning lead tank blocked the forward advance. The crippled rear vehicle blocked the retreat. The massive earthen banks prevented any lateral movement. Superior American numbers suddenly meant nothing. 3 surviving Shermans were confined to a narrow, pre-measured grid, and the German gunners knew the exact distance to every square inch of the grass. With the armor paralyzed, the secondary elements of the German defensive system woke up. Hidden MG-42 machine guns opened fire from the flanks, sweeping the hulls of the Shermans with thousands of rounds of tracer fire. This relentless fusillade was not designed to destroy the heavy armor. It had a purely psychological and mechanical purpose. It forced the American tank commanders, who usually fought with their heads exposed to maintain situational awareness, to violently drop down and slam their steel hatches shut. This was the final, fatal mechanism of the ambush. A tank with its hatches sealed is essentially a blind steel box. Inside, the trapped crews were deafened by the roar of their own idling engines, the clatter of the radio, and the terrifying, relentless hammering of machine gun fire striking their armor. Their only view of the outside world was restricted. The trailing tanks immediately halt. Turrets traverse frantically, gunners squinting through their optics, searching for a target, to narrow glass periscopes. These tiny viewing ports were quickly obscured by kicked-up dirt, rain, and the thick, oily smoke pouring from their destroyed platoon mates. Sensory deprivation took hold. The American gunners frantically rotated their turrets, firing 75mm high-explosive shells blindly into the surrounding tree lines. Hoping to hit a target they could not actually see, they were firing at ghosts. The German guns, entombed in the earth and firing from oblique angles, remained perfectly camouflaged. They calmly reloaded, waiting for the smoke to shift, and then fired again. Every time a Sherman paused to find its bearings, another armor-piercing shell slammed into an exposed flank. The massive American mechanical advantage had been completely neutralized by dirt, roots, and geometry. The armored crews were dying inside their machines, entirely cut off from the battlefield. If the mighty 30-ton vehicles were blind, deaf, and unable to maneuver, the burden of dismantling this invisible system fell to the men outside the steel. Who was left to actually locate the hidden mechanism? While the tank crews fought a blind, claustrophobic war inside their steel boxes, the burden of sight fell to the men bleeding in the grass. The American infantrymen and artillery forward observers, pinned down by the same grazing machine gun fire, pressed their faces into the Norman dirt. They were the only ones who could call in the heavy artillery or direct the surviving tanks. To do that, they needed coordinates. The accompanying infantry pressed their bodies into the dirt, rifles aimed at the distant hedgerow. They wait for the second shot. They raised their standard-issue 6x30 field binoculars, scanning the dense wall of the opposing hedgerow, waiting for the German anti-tank gun to fire again. They were looking for the two classic signatures of field artillery, smoke and flash. In previous campaigns, a heavy gun firing a high-velocity shell announced itself, with a massive, billowing cloud of white or grey smoke. But the German military chemical industry had fundamentally altered the visual rules of the battlefield. The Pak-40 ammunition utilized a highly refined smokeless propellant. Smokeless was a relative military term. It did not mean the chemical reaction was completely invisible. Firing the shell still produced a faint, translucent blue-gray haze. But when this thin vapor was vented through the dense, leafy canopy of an ancient Norman ash tree and filtered by the damp morning air, it simply dissolved. There was no thick white plume to mark the origin of the shot. The accompanying muzzle flash, already suppressed by the dirt tunnel, was entirely masked by the deep shadows of the foliage. The infantrymen stared through their lenses until their eyes watered, looking at a solid wall of green and brown. The optical physics of their binoculars, designed to magnify distant shapes against a contrasting background, were useless. There was no contrast. The camouflage netting, the earthen banks, and the steel gun shield all registered as the exact same texture. The infantry radios buzzed with desperate calls to the rear. They wait for the flash that will betray the German gunners' position, but the field remains entirely quiet, save for the crackling fire of the dying tank. If the men on the ground could not see the guns, the solution was supposed to come from the sky. American tactical doctrine relied heavily on aerial reconnaissance. Small, slow-flying Piper Cub observation planes circled high above the battlefield, immune to the ground-level geometry of the reverse slope. The pilots leaned out of their canvas-covered cockpits, looking directly down into the fields, to spot the hidden German positions. But the aerial observers faced a different optical illusion. From 3,000 feet, the bocage looked like a seamless grid of thick green walls. The German guns were not parked behind the hedges, where a pilot could see them from above. Because the weapons were tunneled directly into the massive root systems, the overhead canopy of leaves remained completely unbroken. To the Piper Cub pilots, the fields appeared empty. They could report the burning American tanks, but they could not provide coordinates for the artillery to strike back. The American observer was caught in a lethal paradox. The armor was dying because it was blind. The infantry was pinned down because the armor could not provide covering fire. The artillery and air support were useless because the infantry could not provide a target. Every technological and optical tool the American military possessed to find the enemy had failed against a mound of dirt and a carefully constructed field of fire. This is the contradiction that paralyzed American armor in the first weeks of the Normandy campaign. An armor-piercing shell capable of punching through inches of sloped steel. The standoff was mathematically unsustainable. If an observer waited long enough for the camouflage to slip, or for a German crew to make a mistake, the remaining Shermans would be systematically dismantled. The Americans had to stop looking for the physical weapon. If standard optics and aerial observation could not expose a perfectly camouflaged steel barrel, the men on the ground had to find a completely different way to break the system. Pinned in the crushed grass, inhaling the acrid smoke of their burning armor, the American infantry stopped looking for steel. Standard optics had failed them. Staring at the dense green wall only produced a lethal optical illusion. To find the invisible weapon, the American observer had to step inside the mind of the man pulling the lanyard. They had to stop looking for the gun itself and start looking for the geometric requirements of the gun. This was the tactical adaptation of reading the negative space. The surviving infantrymen began to reverse engineer the German kill zone, using the only concrete data point they had, the dead Sherman. An observer would trace the fatal geometry backward. At combat ranges, is not fired by a sniper hiding in a tree. It requires a heavy anti-tank gun. If the entry hole was punched cleanly through the right side of the hull, the shot had to originate from the right flank. If the angle of penetration was perfectly horizontal, the weapon could not be firing from the bottom of the sunken road. It had to be elevated inside the earthen bank itself. The Americans realized that while a heavy anti-tank gun could be perfectly camouflaged, it was still a massive industrial machine bound by physical constraints. An armor-piercing shell cannot travel through a 3-foot-thick solid oak trunk. It cannot phase through ancient boulders. The barrel requires an absolutely unobstructed firing lane to reach its target. Therefore, the weapon could only be placed where the natural architecture of the bocage allowed it. The observers stopped scanning the dense foliage for movement. They started looking for the gaps. They looked for microscopic anomalies in the landscape. A veteran sergeant or a trained artillery spotter would scan the distant hedgerow for a patch of leaves that appeared slightly off-color, wilting faster than the surrounding branches because they had been cut and draped over a barrel. They looked for a section. In this theater, that usually meant a German Pak-40. This weapon weighs more than 3,000 pounds. Of the earthen wall that lacked the chaotic, protruding roots found everywhere else along the line, they searched for a subtle, unnatural shadow where the thick vegetation seemed perfectly trimmed to create a narrow window. The American soldiers learned to read the hedgerow not as a natural barrier, but as a deliberate military structure. They calculated the angle from the destroyed tank, identified the necessary firing lane, and locked their eyes on a specific, seemingly ordinary patch of dirt. The observer could not see the steel gun shield. He could not see the crew waiting in the dark. But the mathematics of the reverse slope dictated that the weapon simply had to be exactly there. The invisible system had finally been mapped, but a mental calculation in the mud was only the first step. Knowing where the gun was hidden did not neutralize it. To destroy a reinforced, tunneled bunker, the infantry needed to direct heavy firepower precisely onto that spot. They could not call in a massive divisional artillery barrage on a mere hunch. It requires a crew of at least 5 men to operate. It is a massive, cumbersome piece of industrial artillery, and the blinded, terrified tank crews trapped in the field could not afford to waste their limited, high-explosive shells shooting at every suspicious shadow. The observer needed absolute proof. He needed to strip away the physical camouflage and force the hidden system to expose itself to the armor. How could a man armed only with a rifle confirm the exact location of an entombed artillery piece without sending another 30-ton machine forward to its death? The infantry observer lying in the grass did not raise his rifle. Firing a .30 caliber bullet into a dirt wall would accomplish nothing. Instead, he signaled the heavy weapons squad positioned further back in the field. The answer to the entombed artillery piece was not a heavier shell, but a chemical marker. The infantry called for a 60mm mortar strike, requesting a very specific payload, white phosphorus. The mortar team calculated the trajectory and dropped the round down the tube. It arched over the battlefield and plunged directly into the suspected firing lane the observer had identified. When a white phosphorus shell detonates, it scatters burning chemical fragments that ignite instantly upon contact with the air. These fragments clung to the carefully arranged camouflage netting, the cut branches, and the dry leaves masking the German slit. The air smells of hot diesel exhaust, crushed summer grass, and the ozone tang of a recent artillery barrage. When a gun of that size fires, the physics of expanding gases dictate that it must displace an enormous volume of air. The fire burned away the natural concealment in seconds. More importantly, the chemical reaction generated a towering, brilliant plume of impossibly dense white smoke. This unnatural cloud hung heavily in the air, creating a blindingly obvious visual marker against the dark green landscape. The invisible coordinate had been painted, but marking the target only solved half the problem. The surviving Shermans were still sealed shut, their crews blind and deaf inside the steel. An infantryman had to physically bridge the gap between the observer's eyes and the tank's gun. A soldier crawled through the crushed grass, maneuvering under the grazing fire of German machine guns until he reached the rear of the idling Sherman. He pressed himself against the hot metal exhaust grills and reached for a small steel box welded to the back of the hull. Inside was a field telephone, an infantry handset hardwired directly into the tank's internal intercom system. He pulled the receiver to his ear. In the deafening noise of the battlefield, the infantryman spoke directly into the headset of the tank commander, sitting just inches away on the other side of the armor. The instructions were simple and purely mechanical. Traverse, right, elevate, look through the periscope, find the column of white smoke. Inside the turret, the gunner cranked the traverse wheel. The long barrel of the 75mm main gun swung toward the burning phosphorus. It should kick up a massive cloud of dust from the ground. It should produce a bright, unmistakable tongue of flame from the muzzle brake. He did not need to see the physical outline of the Pak-40. He only needed to see the white pillar marking its grave. The tank fired a high-explosive shell. The round crossed the field and slammed directly into the marked coordinate. The sheer kinetic energy of the blast shattered the earthen bank. The ancient root system splintered. The dirt roof of the tunnel collapsed violently inward, crushing the German crew and burying the heavy gun beneath tons of Norman soil. The trap was broken. This was the combined arms solution. It was not a miracle weapon or a stroke of strategic genius. It was a painstaking, highly coordinated loop. The infantry read the terrain, the mortars marked the anomaly. The soldier on the telephone guided the armor, the tank delivered the final blow. By fusing their separate tools into one integrated system, the Americans had successfully dismantled the reverse slope defense. They had figured out how to kill the invisible gun, but the geometry of the bocage was relentless. Breaking one trap only bought the platoon a few 100 yards of dirt. Beyond the ruined hedgerow lay another field, another earthen wall, and another hidden gun. To measure the true impact of this tactical evolution, we have to look at the bill it presented to the men executing it. What was the ultimate human cost of this grinding, field-by-field dissection? The system of the field, telephone, and white phosphorus was a brilliant, pragmatic solution, but it was not a bloodless equation. The violent recoil should physically shake the vegetation around it, to a dozen trained American observers actively looking for it. It relied entirely on the vulnerability of the infantryman. To find the invisible gun, an American rifleman had to physically expose himself to the exact same kill zone that had just shattered 30 tons of armored steel. The cost of this tactical evolution was measured directly in the lives of the men crawling through the crushed summer grass. They became the fragile, living sensors for blind machines. They bled to buy the coordinates. On the other side of the earthen wall, the German reality was just as fatalistic. The reverse slope ambush was a masterpiece of localized geometry, but it was fundamentally a suicide pact. The entombed Pack 40 was devastating precisely because it was immovable. The moment the white phosphorus landed, and the bright plume of chemical smoke marked the firing slit, the German crew lost all meaningful options. They could not drag a 3-ton artillery piece backward through the dense roots. They could not abandon the pit under the grazing fire of American coaxial machine guns. Their system traded survival for one perfect, invisible shot. Once the American observers learned to read the negative space of the hedgerow, the ancient earthworks transformed from impenetrable bunkers into pre-dug graves. This microscopic, claustrophobic war did not end after a single victory. The Norman bocage stretched for thousands of square miles, an endless grid of identical pastures and sunken lanes. Over the sweltering weeks of July 1944, this exact brutal sequence, the blind advance, the sudden metallic impact, a weapon of that scale cannot simply vanish into the landscape. Yet, the lead tank was burning, and the horizon was perfectly still. The frantic visual search, the white smoke, and the explosive conclusion was repeated hundreds of times. The landscape became an industrial slaughterhouse, demanding a relentless supply of replacement tanks, fresh infantry drafts, and recovery vehicles to drag the burned-out Shermans back to the repair depots. Look back at that idling armored platoon on the crest of the hill in the opening moments of the ambush. The burning lead tank, the perfectly silent field, the invisible enemy. The question was never really about how a single heavy weapon managed to hide in the brush. It was about the violent collision of two incompatible systems. It was about an American doctrine built for the sweeping, open plains of North Africa, crashing directly into a 1,000-year-old agricultural fortress. It was about how a modern military machine is forced to completely rewrite its most basic instincts, how it sees, how it communicates, and what it considers the high ground when its own mathematical rules are weaponized against it. The sheer weight of the Allied industrial apparatus eventually broke the bocage, but the reverse slope was not dismantled by grand strategy or by generals moving symbols on a map. It was dismantled by the human beings forced to live inside the terrible friction of the mechanism. It was broken by the young tank drivers navigating blindly through oily smoke, the artillery observers staring into the green canopy until their vision blurred, and the German gunners waiting to suffocate in the dark. The Americans were looking directly at the terrain that had killed them, and they could see absolutely nothing. It was broken by unnamed American infantrymen gripping black plastic telephone receivers against the searing hot steel of an engine exhaust, shouting coordinates while the air cracked around them. Long after the front lines finally moved eastward, the fields returned to silence. The torn vegetation slowly grew back over the collapsed dirt tunnels, leaving only the rusted, empty steel hulls settling quietly into the deep shadows of the Norman trees. The crew of the lead Sherman had not made a mistake. They had followed standard tactical geometry. They had seized the visual advantage. To understand how they were destroyed without ever seeing their executioner, we first have to understand why their commanders believed that holding the high ground guaranteed their safety. Before a tank commander ever set foot in the mud of northern France, he learned the geometry of war on a chalkboard, and then on the sweeping, dusty plains of American training grounds. The core law of armored combat was simple and seemingly unbreakable. Take the high ground. The platoon commander in the lead Sherman tank raises his binoculars, scanning the terrain ahead. Directly in front of him is a pasture. In the vast deserts of North Africa or the rolling steppes of Eastern Europe, elevation equaled survival. If your tank sat on a ridge, your gunner could look down the forward slope and dominate miles of open country. Line of sight was a two-way street, but holding the crest gave you the first look, the longest reach, and the first shot. This was not arrogance. It was the mathematical reality of long-range ballistics. An American armored platoon moving through the Norman countryside operated heavily on this exact logic. When they approached a rise in the terrain, doctrine dictated a methodical process. They would crest the hill, scan the opposite slope, identify the enemy defensive line, and bring up suppressive fire before committing the rest of the armor. The crew of the destroyed lead Sherman had done precisely this. The commander had stood in his hatch. The gunner had peered through his optical sights, designed to pick out the sharp edges of a German vehicle at 1,000 yards. They looked across the shallow bowl of the pasture. They inspected the opposite ridge. They saw nothing. But the ancient landscape of the bocage actively punished the mathematics of the open plain. The moment the 30-ton Sherman pushed its steel tracks, roughly 150 yards deep, sloping downward to form a shallow bowl. At the far edge sits another dense wall of trees, earth, and interwoven roots. Over the lip of that rise, the engine straining as the driver worked the gears, the machine entered a zone of severe physical vulnerability. As the hull tilted upward to climb the crest, the main gun pointed uselessly into the sky. Worse, the upward angle completely exposed the thin armor of the tank's lower belly and the fragile drive sprockets. In standard combat, this brief, awkward exposure was merely the cost of doing business. The commander accepted the risk because he believed that once he leveled out on the top of the hill, he would possess absolute visual control over the space ahead. That belief relied on a massive assumption about how the enemy would choose to fight. American training assumed a rational defender would also want to maximize their field of view. Therefore, a German anti-tank gun was expected to be positioned on the opposite forward slope, dug into the dirt, looking down into the valley to shoot at the Americans as they crossed the open space. If a massive 3-ton artillery piece was sitting on that opposite hillside, the American optics would find it. They would spot the freshly dug earth, the unnatural, angular shape of the steel gun shield, or the sudden movement of the loader. The commander gives the order to advance. The driver engages the clutch, the steel tracks bite into the soil, and the 30-ton machine rolls over the crest. The American gunner, in the final seconds before the impact, had scanned exactly where the manuals told him to look. He checked the dominant terrain. He checked the obvious firing lanes. But the lethal armor-piercing shell did not come from the opposite ridge. It did not come from a position that maximized its own field of view. The German gunner had deliberately abandoned the fundamental rule of visual dominance. The shot that killed the Sherman came from a place the American optics could not reach, fired by a crew that had willingly blinded themselves to the vast majority of the battlefield. The defenders had traded the comfortable illusion of the high ground for a much deadlier, localized advantage. If the heavy gun was not on the forward slope, and it was not sitting exposed in the open valley below, the surviving American crews had to ask a terrifying question: where exactly was the weapon hiding? When the planners back in England studied aerial photographs of the Normandy Peninsula, they saw a patchwork of small fields divided by dark green lines. To an intelligence officer reading a map, these lines were categorized simply as vegetation. Many American soldiers expected something resembling an English garden hedge. According to everything this crew has been taught, they have just done exactly what they are supposed to do. They hold the high ground, or at worst, a thick row of rural American brush that a 30-ton tank could easily crush under its tracks. That assumption died on the first day in the fields. The Norman bocage was not a bush. It was a 1,000-year-old earthwork. For centuries, local farmers had cleared rocks from their pastures and piled them at the property lines, packing them with clay and dirt to form solid boundary walls. Over generations, these banks grew to be 4 to 6 feet thick at the base, rising up to 10 feet above the sunken dirt roads that ran between them. On top of these massive earthen dikes grew oak, ash, hawthorn, and dense tangles of brambles. Beneath the soil, the root systems of these trees had interwoven with the ancient stones, creating a subterranean skeleton of wood and rock. The result was a natural fortification that possessed the structural integrity of reinforced concrete. The German infantry and anti-tank crews did not simply park their weapons behind these hedgerows, they buried them inside. When a German crew prepared a firing position for a Pak-40, they dug directly into the base of the earthen bank. They carved out a deep pit for the crew and the breech of the weapon. Then they tunneled forward, pushing the long, slender barrel through the thick roots and dirt until only the very tip of the muzzle brake protruded. They have visual dominance over the forward slope of the next field. A dozen infantrymen crouch along the flanks, their eyes tracking the distant foliage on the American side. Finally, they carefully drape the opening with natural foliage, blending the steel perfectly into the shadows of the overhanging trees. This structural entombment physically altered how the weapon behaved when fired. The violent blast of expanding gases that usually betrayed an anti-tank gun was instantly absorbed by the surrounding environment. The thick dirt tunnel acted as a crude mechanical suppressor. The brilliant muzzle flash was hidden deep within the shadows of the thick vegetation. The massive dust cloud, which typically kicked up from the ground to mark an artillery strike, never materialized. The energy dissipated harmlessly into the wet Norman earth and the dense canopy of leaves above. The 3-ton machine had completely vanished into the landscape. It was immune to casual observation, indifferent to shrapnel, and largely invisible to aerial reconnaissance. But this perfect camouflage came at a severe operational cost. By burying the gun inside a narrow tunnel of dirt and roots, the German crew severely restricted the weapon's movement. A Pak-40 sitting in an open field could traverse its barrel to track a moving target across a wide horizon. Entombed in the bocage, the barrel could only shift a few degrees left or right. The gunner's optics were reduced to peering through a claustrophobic slit, looking at a very specific, incredibly narrow patch of grass in the field ahead. The German crew had blinded themselves to the vast majority of the battlefield. For the slightest movement, the field is silent, it is empty. Then the air shatters. There is no warning whistle. They could not scan the horizon. They could not track a flanking maneuver. They could only fire at what crossed directly through the tiny, predetermined window of their gun sight. The question was, if the German gunners were staring at a single, isolated patch of empty dirt, how did they guarantee that an American tank would drive precisely into the one spot where they could actually pull the trigger? To guarantee a kill through a narrow slit in the earth, the German gunner did not hunt the American tank. He let the terrain dictate exactly where the tank had to go. This was the lethal geometry of the reverse slope defense, adapted specifically for the claustrophobic squares of the Norman bocage. The German tactical manual demanded discipline over aggression. When an American armored column approached a gradual rise, standard logic suggested the defenders should place their anti-tank guns on the opposite forward slope, facing the Americans as they came over the top. But this traditional setup had a distinct mechanical flaw. It meant the two forces would face each other directly. The German gunner would have to shoot at the thickest, heavily sloped frontal armor of the Sherman, while exposing his own position to the combined optics of the entire American column. The defenders solved this by conceding the high ground entirely. There is no visible muzzle flash against the green line of the far trees. There is only a sharp, mechanical crack. Instead of defending the front of the hill, they fortified the backside, known as the reverse slope, and the lateral hedgerows that ran perpendicular to the American advance. They positioned the deeply buried Pak-40 at an oblique angle, aiming horizontally across the field rather than straight toward the enemy. The gun was not pointed at the crest of the hill. It was pre-aimed at a very specific patch of ground on the downward slope. This created an enfilade, a tightly controlled crossfire zone, where the weapon was fundamentally misaligned with the American line of sight. When the lead American tank confidently rolled over the crest, its crew scanned the distant, empty tree line. They saw no threat ahead. But as the 30-ton machine began its descent down the reverse slope, it was no longer facing the hidden German gun. The tank was moving laterally across the gunner's extremely narrow field of view. The geometry shifted immediately in the defender's favor. The heavy, sloped steel of the Sherman's front glacis was now tactically irrelevant. The tank was forced to expose its most vulnerable flank. The side armor of a standard Sherman was only about 1.5 inches thick, standing perfectly vertical and mounted directly over the ammunition racks and fuel reserves. For the German crew waiting in their dark tunnel of dirt,